What if a forgotten house clinging to the edge of a canyon was never meant to be a home but a warning? And what if a weary veteran and his loyal dog were the only ones who could hear that warning in time? This is the journey of John and Buddy, a story of danger, hope, and the quiet miracles that guide us back to purpose. May your heart be open as you step into their world. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop your country in the comments below and subscribe. Winter pressed against the small mountain town with a quiet and steady weight. The kind of cold that did not simply rest on the skin, but moved deeper until it settled behind the ribs. Snow drifted in slow curls along the edges of the old hardware store, where an aging blue pickup truck sat half buried in frost. Its metal frame was scarred with rust and long trails of paint that time had scraped away. It looked less like a vehicle and more like a shelter, clinging to the last bit of warmth in a world that had turned white. Inside the truck, John Miller woke slowly. His breath rose into the dim interior as a faint mist. He blinked against the pale light pushing through the frosted windows. His back ached from the way he had slept, twisted slightly among blankets that had lost most of their softness. He lay still for a moment, feeling the familiar stiffness in his shoulders and the old pulse of pain in his knee. A souvenir from another life. A life spent overseas where he learned the meaning of endurance long before he ever slept inside a truck. At his feet, Buddy stirred. The German shepherd shifted his weight and rested his head on John's shin. His thick winter coat shimmered in the dim light, shades of gray and tan merging like smoke along his back. His breathing was steady and warm, the kind of warmth that reminded John he was not alone. "Morning, Buddy." The dog lifted his head. His ears perked up, and his eyes glowed with gentle alertness. Then he stretched, pushing his paws against the blankets and shaking off sleep. John pushed open the truck door. A rush of cold air swept in at once. Snow crunched under his boots when he stepped outside. Buddy jumped down beside him, leaving neat prints on the thin layer of frost. The dog stayed close, brushing against John's leg as though to make sure the day ahead began with both of them side by side. Another day, another search for work, another set of hours weathered because there was no other choice. In town, John often took odd jobs, clearing snow, carrying lumber, stacking crates behind the grocery store. Anything that paid enough for fuel and a few meals. Winter made the work scarce and the nights colder. Still, he pushed forward each day with steady resolve. He had lived through worse than broken sleep and numb fingers. And Buddy was a constant presence, loyal in a way only a dog could be. Before looking for work, John walked Buddy behind the diner on the corner. The cook often left scraps from breakfast for the dog. Buddy waited politely at the back steps, tail tapping lightly against the snow. John held his hands near the warm air spilling from the kitchen door and felt the stiffness in his fingers ease just a bit. Life had become a rhythm built on small mercies. A meal here, a warm breeze from a doorway there. The steady companionship of a dog who never once wavered. When John and Buddy returned to the truck, he noticed something unusual sitting on the hood. A small envelope weighed down by a thin stone. Paper was crisp and surprisingly clean for a winter morning. His name was written on it in tight, careful handwriting, John Miller. He paused. The air around him felt strangely still as he picked it up. Inside was a single letter printed in firm black ink. The county office of Deep Canyon, confirmed that a property belonging to his late uncle had been transferred to his name. The letter explained that the uncle had passed away weeks earlier and had left behind a house perched on the edge of the canyon. The structure was described as unique and historic, a place built partly into the rocky cliff face itself. The letter requested that John come to inspect it whenever possible and sign a few final documents. John lowered the paper slowly. He had not seen his uncle in many years. The older man had lived a solitary life and had always been more comfortable in nature than in town. John had faint memories of spending summers with him as a child, memories of pine trees and a rough wooden porch, and a voice that carried calm in every word. But as years passed and life turned complicated, they drifted apart. Buddy nudged John's knee gently, as if sensing a shift in the air. John folded the letter and looked around the quiet parking lot. Snowflakes drifted down in slow spirals. Everything felt muted except for the strange weight of the news in his hands. A house. A house on the edge of Deep Canyon. A house built into stone. He could hardly imagine it. In the years since he left the service, he had never had a real place to rest. Not in the way most people meant when they said the word home. He had lived in spare rooms and old motels, and finally this truck. A house felt like something from another lifetime. But the letter was real, and so was the cold, biting deeper into his bones. He looked at Buddy. The dog watched him closely. Calm, trusting, steady. "Well, Buddy, looks like we are heading up the mountain." Buddy tilted his head slightly, then wagged his tail once, the kind of movement that said he was ready for anything as long as they did it together. John packed what little they had: 2 blankets, a thermos, a few cans of food, Buddy's leash, the tools he used for odd jobs. Then he started the truck. The engine coughed before catching, a tired old sound that matched the tired old metal. As they drove out of town, the landscape changed gradually. Storefronts gave way to open fields. Fields gave way to tall, dark pines standing like sentinels. The road sloped upward, and the mountain opened before them. Deep Canyon lay somewhere ahead, wrapped in wind and stone and winter silence. The higher they climbed, the sharper the air became. Buddy stood, with his front paws on the dashboard, nose pressed to the glass, as though he recognized the importance of the journey. John kept one hand on the wheel, and one hand resting lightly on Buddy's back whenever the road straightened. He did not know what waited for him at the end of the climb. Perhaps only a forgotten cabin eaten away by time. Perhaps a place too broken to be lived in. But the letter had called it a special house, a unique structure built near the cliff edge itself. A house that once belonged to someone who had shaped part of John's childhood. And something deep in him stirred. A faint sensation, like standing at the threshold of a door he had not opened for many years. Snow thickened as they neared the canyon. The sky shifted from pale gray to a muted blue. Through breaks in the trees, John glimpsed the vast drop of Deep Canyon, a wide, dark wound carved through rock and ice. The wind rising from it carried a low, steady hum. Buddy pressed closer to the glass. Easy boy. They followed the narrow road until the tires crunched onto a turnout marked by an old wooden sign. The paint was faded, but still legible. Canyon Rim Access. John parked the truck and stepped outside. He breathed in cold air that tasted of pine and stone. Buddy circled once, then stopped beside him waiting. Ahead of them, a small footpath led upward. It wound between tall spruces dusted with snow. At the end of that path, somewhere beyond the tree line, stood the house he had inherited. the one perched on the edge of stone and winter. John adjusted his pack. Buddy moved beside him, like a shadow of fur and warmth. Then they began to walk. The snow whispered under their boots. The wind carried the echo of the canyon far below. And for the first time in a long while, John felt that the road was leading him somewhere instead of simply carrying him through another passing day. He did not know whether the house would bring answers or more questions. But he knew one thing with certainty. He and Buddy would face whatever waited at the top of the trail together. The trail rose steadily along the mountainside, cutting through tall spruces and pines that bowed under the weight of winter snow. The morning had grown brighter, though the sky still carried a pale chill. John walked with slow, careful steps, his boots sinking into the powdery surface. Buddy stayed close at his side, nose lifted toward the cold air, as if reading every shift of wind and scent. The higher they climbed, the more the landscape opened. Through breaks in the trees, John caught glimpses of deep canyon stretching below. It looked like a great stone mouth carved into the earth, its depths wrapped in mist and shadow. Wind surged upward from the chasm in low, steady breaths that made the branches tremble. John kept his eyes on the narrow path ahead. He had no map except the directions in the letter. A half-mile walk from the turnout. A fork in the path marked by an old pine split into two trunks. A steep ascent toward a ridge. And finally, a structure set against the canyon wall. He wondered again what kind of house his uncle had chosen to build here. The man had always been drawn to quiet places, but John had never imagined anything perched on the side of a cliff. But he stopped suddenly. His ears shot forward, and his tail stiffened. "What is it, boy?" John waited. The dog sniffed the air, then moved again with quickened steps. Whatever Buddy sensed was not danger, but curiosity. John followed closely as the trail curved around a final row of trees. The house appeared slowly, like something rising from the mountain itself. It stood partly embedded into the canyon wall, with large wooden beams driven deep into the rock. The front half pushed outward over open air, supported by thick timber struts anchored at sharp angles. The structure seemed to hover above the drop, held between gravity and stubborn craftsmanship. The exterior wood was weathered to a silver gray that blended with the stone behind it. Snow gathered along the roofline and on the narrow porch that faced the canyon. John stared for a long moment. This was no ordinary cabin. It was a dwelling shaped by someone who knew the mountain intimately, someone who understood stone and slope and silence. Buddy trotted toward the porch steps, but paused halfway to look back at John, waiting for permission. "Go ahead." John stepped onto the porch and brushed snow from the railing. His gloved hand felt the grain of the wood beneath the cold surface, solid, old, carefully maintained. Even the bolts anchoring the beams into the cliff had been placed with precise intention. His uncle had built this place with more than simple shelter in mind. He pushed the front door slowly. It creaked, but opened, without resistance. Inside, the air was cold, but clean. Dust lay in thin layers along the floorboards, yet the room did not feel abandoned. It felt paused, as if someone had stepped away only briefly. A small table stood near the window. A heavy coat hung on a wooden peg. Several shelves lined the walls filled with notebooks, maps, and jars of stones collected from places John could not guess. A narrow bed rested in the corner, covered by a folded wool blanket. The most striking features were on the far wall. Large maps drawn by hand were pinned with careful spacing. Most showed Deep Canyon, but with unusual markings. layers of contour lines, paths of underground flow, circles drawn around certain ridges. Several tables held metal instruments used for geological surveys, calipers, sample hammers, an old handheld sensor with wires coiled neatly beside it. Buddy moved between the tables, nose lowering toward the floor. His ears twitched once then again. He sniffed harder, pressing his muzzle against a narrow space between two floorboards. John frowned. Buddy rarely reacted without reason. The dog stepped back, then lowered his head again, listening. His body became perfectly still. Only his ears moved small, incremental shifts like delicate antennas searching for a signal. John knelt beside him and placed a hand on the floor. A faint tremor pulsed beneath the wood. Not strong, not steady. More like a quiet heartbeat deep under stone. He held his breath and waited. Another tremor. Slight, but certain. The house was responding to something below. Buddy looked at him with intense focus. John could see it in the dog's eyes. A recognition, a warning, a question. All right, boy. I feel it too. John stood slowly and scanned the room again. Now that he knew the tremor was real, the maps and tools around him seemed to carry different meaning. His uncle had not simply lived here. He had studied something, observed something, perhaps listened to something. John approached the wall of maps and traced a finger over the inked lines. His uncle had annotated them with small marks and thin strokes. There were arrows showing flow directions and notes written in careful script. Most of it referred to underground water, subsurface channels, structural weaknesses in the canyon wall. John stepped back, trying to make sense of the room as a whole. The isolated location of the house, the instruments, the maps, the tremor beneath the floor. None of this felt accidental. Buddy paced, once, then sat facing the same spot where he had sensed the tremor. He lifted one paw slightly, as if insisting that John pay closer attention. Something is under us. John said the words quietly to himself. He crouched again and pressed his palm flat on the floor. The wood was cool, but the tremor repeated. Slow, consistent. It reminded him of the distant rumble of machinery, but softer, more natural, a movement shaped by earth rather than metal. He exhaled slowly. Whatever his uncle had been watching it lived deep beneath this house, deep in the canyon wall or the ground below it. And for some reason, his uncle had wanted the house positioned exactly here, not near the cliff, not facing it, but built into it. John stood and looked out the window facing the canyon. The view stretched endlessly. Mist rose from the depths, and wind swept along the walls, carrying whispers that seemed too soft to interpret. It was easy to imagine someone spending years here, listening, studying, recording the hidden movements beneath the surface. Buddy nudged his leg again. His posture was alert but not afraid. He was urging John to understand. John placed a hand on the dog's head. Good work, Buddy. We will figure this out. He looked once more around the room. The house felt strange, but not unwelcoming. Almost as if it had been waiting for him, waiting for someone to continue what his uncle had begun. For the first time in many years, John felt a hint of something unfamiliar, a quiet sense of direction, a pull toward purpose. Behind him, the floor trembled again, soft as breath, steady as memory. John inhaled deeply and faced the center of the room. Whatever this house was meant to protect or reveal, it was now his responsibility. He did not yet know what waited beneath the floor, or what secrets rested within the stone. But he knew one thing with certainty. Buddy had sensed it first, and together they would uncover what the mountain was trying to say. The tremor beneath the floor returned a third time, faint but deliberate, a quiet pulse moving through the wooden planks, as if the house itself breathed in slow and secret rhythms. John crouched again, his palm flat on the boards, and Buddy stayed beside him, with his body low and ears forward. The dog was focused on a narrow space between two planks near the center of the room. His nose pressed close, and a low, soft whine vibrated in his throat. John tapped the boards lightly with his knuckles. The sound was hollow in one section and solid in the next. He moved his hand along the seam and felt a slight draft escaping from below. The cold air rising through the gap carried a faint earthy scent, like damp stone and minerals. "Well, Buddy, looks like your instincts are right again." Buddy wagged his tail once, a simple movement that carried both pride and encouragement. John searched the edges of the boards more carefully and soon found something subtle. A notch carved into the underside of one plank. It was nearly invisible, tucked against the grain of the wood. He slid his fingertips into the groove and pulled gently. At first nothing moved, but after applying more pressure, the plank lifted slightly. Hidden hinges creaked as the section of floor rose upward, revealing a square opening partly concealed by shadows. A hatch. His uncle had built a hidden entrance beneath the floor. Buddy leaned closer and sniffed the darkness with intense concentration. John lifted the hatch fully. A wooden ladder descended into a narrow chamber below. Cold air drifted upward, carrying the smell of stone and old notebooks. "Stay close, Buddy. We are going down." Buddy gave a soft huff, as if to say he would never do anything else. John stepped onto the ladder and climbed slowly. Each rung creaked under his weight. When his boots touched the stone floor below, he steadied himself. The space was small and carved directly into the mountain. The walls were raw, rock smoothed only where needed. A single lantern hung from a hook, and to John's surprise, it flickered to life when he turned the small switch. The warm glow filled the chamber, revealing a room that seemed untouched for months, yet still organized with patient care. Buddy climbed down next, using the inside edges of the ladder as he had learned during rescue drills with John years ago. When he reached the ground, he shook the dust from his coat and remained alert but calm. John took in the surroundings slowly. Tables lined the walls. Shelves held jars of water samples labeled with dates and hand-drawn symbols. A metal cabinet near the far corner contained rolled maps tied with faded string. Several notebooks were stacked neatly beside a small wooden chair. The air smelled of paper and stone, and the faint metallic tang of mineral dust. His uncle had turned this underground chamber into a research room. John picked up one of the notebooks. The leather cover was cracked at the edges. Inside the handwriting was the same steady script he remembered from childhood birthday cards and holiday notes. The pages were filled with diagrams of the canyon, vertical cross-sections, and long sets of numbers marking pressure changes and water flow. He flipped through more pages. His uncle had been studying the mountain for years. Buddy sniffed a row of jars containing water samples. Some held clear liquid, while others looked cloudy or faintly tinted. The older samples were labeled in tidy handwriting, with dates going back more than a decade. The newer ones looked different. Some had small particles suspended in them, tiny swirls of sediment that did not belong in natural groundwater. John opened another notebook. This one contained pages filled with concern, lines describing drop in flow rates. notes about rhythmic vibrations detected in the rock, comments about potential collapse in narrow channels beneath the canyon floor. His uncle mentioned something called the weak vein, a section of the underground waterway where the rock layers were thin and fragile. Then John found a page that made him stop. Silver Peak operations expanding toward weak vein. He frowned at the name. Silver Peak was the local water company. They managed pumping stations and pipelines for several small towns in the region. John had never heard anything negative about them. But his uncle had drawn a series of arrows showing drilling points moving dangerously close to the thin section of the canyon's subsurface. Another line read simply, "Unstable. Too much pressure loss. Must alert county." No reply. John felt a heaviness settle in his chest. His uncle had tried to warn someone, and no one had listened. Buddy rested his head on John's leg, sensing the shift in his mood. John scratched behind the dog's ear gently, then continued reading. The next entry described increasing discoloration in the water and unexplained heat pockets underground. His uncle believed that Silver Peak had either ignored drilling guidelines or purposely drilled deeper to gain more flow from the underground veins. The consequences were already beginning to show in the samples. A final note caught John's eye. If pressure continues to drop, the canyon wall may shift. Even a minor shift could break the weak vein. Water loss, structural instability, risk to town. John closed the notebook slowly. His uncle had not been eccentric. He had been aware, determined, careful, and clearly alone in his efforts. Buddy stood and moved toward a metal instrument sitting on another table. It was a hydromonitor, a device used to detect vibrations and shifts in underground water. Wires stretched from its base into the stone wall. John switched it on gently. A soft hum filled the chamber, followed by a series of faint, steady pulses. The device responded as if the canyon was speaking through the rock. The same pulse he had felt upstairs traveled through the instrument now. Rhythmic. Warning. Alive. John listened closely. This was not random movement. It had pattern. It had direction. It had urgency. He turned off the device and let the silence settle again. Then he walked to the center of the chamber and looked around one more time. His uncle had built this place because he had discovered something fragile beneath the mountain, something worth protecting, something at risk from careless or greedy hands. John felt the weight of understanding settle deeper into him. Life had brought him back to this mountain for reasons he had not expected. He had come only because of an inheritance, a house perched above a canyon. But the house was more than shelter. It was a message, a responsibility transferred from one man to another. Buddy sat beside him quietly, and John placed a hand on the dog's back. "Looks like this place needs us, Buddy. And we are going to figure out exactly what happened here." He looked at the ladder stretching upward to the house above. The world outside was still white and cold and indifferent. But here under the floor, he felt a sense of direction stronger than anything he had felt since returning home from war. He gathered the notebooks and maps and switched off the lantern. The chamber fell back into shadow. Together, he and Buddy climbed the ladder and stepped once more into the house that watched the canyon below. The tremor beneath their feet returned softly, as if acknowledging that the new keeper had finally heard its call. Morning came with a pale silver light stretching across the canyon ridges, touching the wooden walls of the Cliffside house with a cold quiet that felt heavier now that John understood what lay beneath it. Buddy stood near the door, tail low but alert, watching every shadow as though the mountain might shift again without warning. John gathered the notebooks, maps, and water samples from the hidden chamber and packed them into his old canvas backpack. The weight pulled on his shoulder in a familiar way, the same sensation he remembered from marching across foreign deserts, carrying equipment he did not fully understand but knew mattered. He crouched beside Buddy and rested a hand on the dog's thick coat. "We are going to town, Buddy. We need help." Buddy gave a soft huff of agreement and followed him out into the sharp morning air. The wind pushed along the canyon wall, bending tree branches and sending thin streams of powdery snow drifting across the narrow path. The drive into town took longer than usual. The truck groaned against the frozen incline, and more than once John had to downshift to keep the tires from sliding on the winding road. Buddy braced himself in the passenger seat, eyes fixed ahead, ears flicking at every sound the mountain made. By the time they reached the town square, smoke was rising from chimneys, and the frost on the shop windows glowed in the soft morning sun. People moved slowly along sidewalks dusted with ice, their scarves and jackets pulled tight against the cold. John headed straight for the Frosthaven Public Library, a squat brick building near the center of town. Its tall windows were fogged from the warmth inside, and a small wooden sign creaked softly under the weight of the wind. Inside, it was much warmer. The scent of books, old paper, and lemonwood polish filled the air. A few patrons sat quietly at tables, reading or warming their hands with cups of coffee from the small corner stand. Behind the main desk stood Martha, the longtime librarian. She was in her late 50s, tall and slender, with steel gray hair pinned back into a tidy bun. Her sharp but kind eyes lifted the moment she saw John. "You look like a man carrying something heavy," she said, "not just in your hands." John gave a tired nod. "I need someone to look at these. Someone who knows more than I do." He placed the notebooks and maps on the counter. Martha adjusted her glasses and skimmed the first few pages. Her expression shifted from polite curiosity to something more serious. "This is detailed work, and whoever wrote these knew exactly what they were doing." "My uncle," John replied. "He studied the mountain for years, and he thought something was wrong under Deep Canyon." Martha closed the notebook gently. "Let me get someone," she said. "Someone who might finally take this seriously." She walked toward a door at the back of the library marked Archives. A minute later, she returned with a tall, thin man in his early 70s. He wore a thick wool sweater and moved with a firmness that defied his age. His white beard was trimmed neatly, and his eyes carried the clear focus of a mind that had spent years studying natural patterns. "John, this is Professor Ellis, retired geologist, and stubborn enough to tell the truth even when no one wants to hear it." Ellis gave a short nod. "Show me what you brought." They moved to a large table near the window. John laid out the notebooks, maps, and water samples. Ellis sat, folded his hands, and began reading through the notes with the precision of someone who still ran calculations in his head without needing paper. Minutes passed, then more. The library grew quiet around them. Buddy lay at John's feet, but kept lifting his head whenever Ellis muttered something under his breath. Finally, Ellis exhaled slowly and closed the last notebook. "This is real," he said. "Every observation, every warning. Your uncle was tracking structural changes in the underground vein beneath the canyon." John leaned forward. "And the instability." "It is happening." Ellis gave a grim nod. If these samples and readings are accurate, the weak vein is already thinning. And Silver Peak is drilling far too close. They are ignoring every geological safeguard in place. Martha crossed her arms. I knew something felt wrong when people in town mentioned their wells sputtering last autumn. Ellis tapped the notebook again. Your uncle tried to warn them. No one listened. But you brought this here at the right time. The town needs to know, and so does the county. John felt a knot tighten in his chest. The responsibility that had started as a simple inheritance now pressed on him like a weight. He looked down at Buddy. The dog met his gaze calmly, as if telling him he was not alone. They talked for nearly an hour more, discussing groundwater shifts, pressure patterns, and the potential consequences if the drilling continued. Ellis insisted on making copies of everything to prepare a proper report. Let me study this more tonight, he said. Come back tomorrow. We will move forward together. John thanked them both and headed back toward the truck. Buddy trotted beside him through the icy afternoon air. The sun dipped behind the ridges as they drove back up the canyon road. When the house came into view, hanging against the rock like a stubborn survivor, John felt a strange blend of worry and determination. But something was wrong. A dark-colored truck was parked near the narrow clearing beside his house. It had no company logo, but the tires were fresh and the engine ticked with recent use. A man stood near the front porch waiting. He looked too polished to belong on the mountain. Mid-40s, clean-shaven, dark coat, careful smile. Buddy's posture shifted instantly. He stood tall in the passenger seat, ears sharp, body tense. John stepped out, but kept one hand on Buddy's collar. The man gave a rehearsed, courteous smile. Good evening, Mr. Miller. You have quite a place here. Very unique location. John's tone stayed cautious. Can I help you? The man brushed a bit of frost from his coat. My name is Carl Evans. I represent Silver Peak Water. We understand you have recently inherited this property. We would like to offer you a very generous purchase price, immediate payment, all cash. Buddy stepped forward and blocked Carl's path. His stance was rigid, his tail straight, his chest lifted. A low sound rumbled from his throat. Carl flinched slightly, though he tried to hide it. He is protective, John said, and for good reason. Carl cleared his throat. Silver Peak simply wants to make sure there are no misunderstandings. This land is close to our operations. Owning it would simplify future plans. John stared at him, sensing something hollow behind the man's pleasant tone. What kind of plans? Carl avoided eye contact. Just expansions. Nothing to concern you. If you sell now, you save yourself trouble. The land is difficult, dangerous even. Buddy growled again, louder this time. The sound carried through the canyon air like a warning. Carl took a single step back. Think about the offer, but do not wait too long. He turned quickly and walked to his truck. Moments later, he drove down the narrow path, leaving only tire tracks in the snow. John watched him disappear, then looked at Buddy. You felt it too, Buddy. They are hiding something. Buddy pressed his forehead against John's hand in quiet agreement. The night grew colder. The wind carried a different kind of tension along the canyon walls. John stood at the edge of the deck, gazing into the dark valley below. He finally understood. The house was not the only thing his uncle had left him. He had inherited a fight, and Buddy had already chosen his side. The town hall of Frosthaven filled slowly as morning light drifted across the wooden floorboards. The room smelled of cold air and wool coats and the faint, earthy scent carried in on the boots of residents who had trudged through snow to be present. Rows of old benches lined the chamber, and a low murmur of uneasy conversation rose like a restless tide. John sat near the front, with Buddy lying at his feet. The dog kept his head lifted and his ears sharp. Every sound mattered to him. Every shift of wind at the door, every scrape of a chair leg. John felt the same tension in his own chest, but he kept still. He had faced enough in life to know fear never walked alone. It always brought purpose with it. The council members took their seats. Martha from the library sat along the side wall, clutching a folder of copied notes. Professor Ellis, wrapped in a heavy brown coat, sat with his hands clasped tightly, as if holding back the weight of what he knew must be said. When the commissioner called the session to order, the room settled. Silence stretched over the crowd like a blanket pulled tight. John stood when his name was spoken. Buddy rose beside him, steady and silent. John began with simple words. He described the hidden room beneath his uncle's house and the maps and water samples stored there. He spoke about the weak vein under Deep Canyon and the danger already growing as pressure declined. He explained how Silver Peak had drilled too close to the fragile rock and how the Mach Nuoc had begun to shift in dangerous ways. His tone was level and calm. No anger, no dramatic gestures, only the quiet weight of truth. The council listened. Some leaned forward, some frowned in concentration. A few exchanged uneasy glances, but not everyone believed him. When John finished, the commissioner nodded slowly. Then he turned toward the Silver Peak representatives seated along the right side of the hall. 3 men in pressed suits and dark coats rose to speak. Their leader, a tall man with pale eyes, stepped forward. His voice was smooth and polite. He claimed Silver Peak followed all safety rules. He said the observations of John's uncle were the result of age and misunderstanding. He insisted that the mountain was stable and the drilling harmless. Murmurs moved across the room. People looked from John to the suits and back again. Doubt settled like frost. John felt the sting of it, not for himself, but for the truth his uncle had tried to share for years. He stood silent as the company spoke, his jaw tight, Buddy pressed close to his leg. Then it happened. Buddy stiffened. His ears shot upward. His muscles locked into place. His eyes turned sharply toward the side hallway that led to the maintenance rooms beneath the hall. John knew this posture. He had seen Buddy act like this only once before during a night patrol overseas. It meant danger. Not fear, not confusion. Real danger. Buddy let out a single sharp bark, then another. The room jolted with surprise. Before anyone could react, Buddy lunged toward the hallway and disappeared around the corner. John did not hesitate. He sprinted after him, boots pounding against the old floor. The murmurs behind him turned into a rising wave of alarm. The hallway was dim and colder than the main chamber. Buddy stood at the end scratching at a metal door. A faint hiss slipped into the air, barely audible, but Buddy heard it long before John did. John pulled the door open. A rush of cold, heavy air swept past his face. Inside the maintenance room, he saw it at once. A gas pipe along the wall had split open at a rusted seam. A thin stream of gas seeped into the air. Pumps and heaters in the building hummed nearby. One spark would have turned the entire hall into a blast of fire and debris. John shouted for the building to be cleared. Workers rushed in with emergency tools. The hall emptied in minutes. People emerged into the snow-filled courtyard, shaken and pale. Some whispered prayers. Some held their children close. The commissioner approached John with a trembling voice. If your dog had not warned us, this place would have gone up before the end of the meeting. Buddy stood beside John, panting lightly, but still alert. His eyes scanned the hallway, as if checking again for anything the human ear might miss. Word spread quickly among the crowd. Residents looked at John differently now, with gratitude, with respect, with something like trust awakening for the first time. Martha put a hand on his arm. Your uncle was not wrong, she said, and neither are you. Professor Ellis nodded firmly. After this, no one can claim the danger is imagined. The town must act. Even the commissioner seemed shaken into clarity. He announced that an independent review of Silver Peak's operations would begin immediately. A second hearing would be held. Evidence would be gathered. This time, the town would listen. John looked down at Buddy, who sat calmly beside him. Snow clung to the dog's fur. His breath turned into pale mist in the cold air. Good work, Buddy. Buddy pressed his head gently into John's hand. The danger had been real. The gas leak had not come from sabotage, but from neglect. Yet it had revealed something deeper. The town had seen the truth with their own eyes. John no longer stood alone. The mountain had spoken through tremors. The old research had spoken through pages. And Buddy had spoken through instinct that could not be argued away. Something had shifted. Not just in the council chamber, not just beneath the canyon. Something had shifted in the hearts of the people who now understood what was at stake. John felt it too, a quiet certainty settling into his bones. The fight for the mountain had only begun, but he would not face it alone. Night settled over Deep Canyon with a heaviness that felt older than the mountain itself. Snow clouds gathered in thick layers above the ridge, swallowing the pale moonlight and turning the world into a dim gray hush. The wind pressed against the cliffside house in long, steady breaths, rattling the wooden frame with a low moan. John stood near the small window, holding a lantern and listening to the distant rumble of the storm rolling down the valley. The old glass trembled as the first wave of snow hit the canyon walls. Buddy paced the room slowly, his paws silent on the wooden floor, but his body tense. He always sensed things before John did. The storm arrived fast. Snow swirled sideways instead of falling, and the wind screamed through the trees lining the cliff. John checked the radio, but static answered. He knew the mountain roads would be dangerous now. Even the most experienced drivers avoided traveling during storms like this. But he stopped pacing. His ears lifted sharply. His body stiffened into a single line of focus as he faced the door. What is it, Buddy? John waited. The wind roared, but Buddy did not move. Then a faint sound slipped through the storm. It was not wind, not the groan of branches. It was softer. A broken call carried upward by the wind. A human voice. Buddy barked once, sharp and urgent. Then he pushed his nose against the door. All right, I hear it. Let us go. John pulled on his heavy jacket and gloves. Buddy was already braced against the storm when the door opened. Snow whipped across the porch in thick waves. The cold hit John like a blow, but Buddy leapt forward into the night with certainty. Stay close, Buddy. Lead the way. They moved along the ridge path. The snow was already knee-deep in places, and the wind cut like shards of ice. Buddy kept his head low and followed a scent John could not understand. They crossed a bend in the path, where the mountain dropped sharply into darkness. John felt the storm pulse against him, trying to push him sideways, but he held steady. After several minutes, Buddy stopped suddenly. He barked again, but this time, the bark echoed strangely. The snowstorm opened briefly, and John saw it. Below the ridge, a section of snow had collapsed down the slope, leaving behind a small landslide. At the bottom of the slide lay a dark shape half buried in snow. A truck. John scrambled down with Buddy racing ahead. As he approached, he saw the faded logo on the side of the metal truck bed. Silver Peak Water. The cab was crushed on one side. Snow drifted through the broken window and coated the dashboard. A muffled voice came from inside. "Help! Anyone! Help!" Buddy dug at the snow, with frantic strength revealing the side door. John forced it open and found the driver slumped across the seat. His forehead was bleeding, and his breaths were shallow but steady. "We have got you. Hang on." Another weak voice rose from the truck bed. John moved quickly to the back and pulled aside more snow. Two workers were trapped inside the rear compartment where equipment had shifted during the slide. One of them, a young man with a freckled face, clung to a strap with trembling hands. "The whole ridge fell," he said through chattering teeth. "We were trying to secure the pump shed before the audit." The road gave way. John helped them climb free one by one. Buddy stayed close to each man, stabilizing them as they crawled through the snow. Once they were clear, John guided them up the slope in slow, careful steps. The storm showed no mercy. It pushed against them with relentless force. By the time they reached the porch of the Cliffside house, the workers were shaking violently from the cold. John brought blankets and water. Buddy lay beside the injured driver, warming him with his body heat, while John tended to the bleeding forehead. The freckled worker sat on the floor, leaning against the wall. His eyes were wide with fear and exhaustion. After a long moment, he spoke quietly. "You did not have to save us. Not after everything." John replied gently. "People are people. Storms do not care who we work for. We help each other, or we do not make it home." The young man lowered his gaze. He reached into his jacket with unsteady fingers and pulled out a sealed envelope wrapped in plastic to keep it dry. He hesitated before offering it to John. "Take this. You deserve to know what is in it. Someone at the company made copies. They did not want to be part of this anymore. They said if anything happened to us, we should give it to someone who could stop them. You are the only one who tried to help instead of turning away." John took the envelope slowly. It felt heavier than its size should allow. Inside were several pages of diagrams and internal reports. They showed drilling coordinates, pressure charts, maps of underground veins, and worst of all, a set of red lines marking where Silver Peak had drilled beyond their permitted zone, directly into the weak vein John's uncle had tried so hard to protect. Buddy lifted his head and pressed his nose against John's arm, as if urging him to look closer. John studied the papers. The truth was clear. Silver Peak had ignored every safety boundary. They had pushed into the fragile part of the canyon, knowing there was risk. The loss of pressure his uncle recorded was not an accident. It was the result of intentional drilling driven by profit. The worker spoke again. His voice was rough with guilt. "We tried to warn the supervisors. They told us to keep quiet. Said no one would believe us anyway. But now you have the proof. You can stop them." John folded the documents carefully and set them on the table. The storm thrashed against the windows, but inside the house, a deeper stillness settled. "Thank you," he said. "You did the right thing." The young man nodded. and wiped his face with shaking hands. Buddy lay down at John's feet, his breathing steady after the rescue. Snow melted slowly across his fur. John placed a hand on the dog's back, feeling once again that his loyal companion had seen danger long before any human ear could hear it. Outside, the storm continued its relentless howl. But inside the Cliffside house, something stronger than the wind took shape. A turning point, a truth that could no longer be buried. Proof that could change everything. John looked at the papers again. The fight was far from over. But now the mountain had given him the evidence he needed. And Buddy, as always, had guided him straight toward it. The storm passed in the early hours of dawn, leaving the canyon coated in thick waves of snow that sparkled under the first pale light. John stood on the porch of the Cliffside house with Buddy beside him, watching the quiet valley as the wind settled into gentle breaths. The rescued workers still slept inside near the stove, recovering from the night's ordeal. But John's mind was already fixed on the next step. The documents he had received were decisive. And now, the truth had a path to follow. By midday, the workers felt strong enough to return to town with help from the county rescue team. The freckled young man shook John's hand before leaving. His voice was steady now, though his eyes still held fear from the night before. "Do something with the truth," he said. "Do what we could not." John nodded. Buddy pressed close to him, as if sealing the promise. When the next hearing was announced, word spread quickly. Townspeople arrived early, filling every bench before the session began. The atmosphere was different now. Less doubt, less distance. People looked at John with quiet expectation. Even the commissioner greeted him with a firm nod. Professor Ellis stood ready, with stacks of charts and printed diagrams. Martha held copies of the notebooks and maps. The rescued workers sat near the back of the hall, wrapped in blankets, but determined to stay. Buddy lay beside John at the front, calm but alert as always. When the hearing opened, John stepped forward and placed the envelope of internal documents on the table. The commissioner gestured for him to begin. John spoke simply. "These papers were given to me by one of the workers we rescued in the storm. They show the drilling coordinates of Silver Peak. They show the real depths, the real boundaries, and the violations." Gasps moved through the room as the commissioner reviewed the sheets. Red lines marked illegal boundary extensions. Shaded zones showed areas where pressure levels had collapsed. A set of notes from a Silver Peak supervisor revealed warnings that had been ignored for months. Professor Ellis took the floor next. He moved with a slow, firm stride and unfolded a large map of the canyon. He explained how the weak vein beneath Deep Canyon was formed by thin layers of stone that required stable pressure. He pointed to the areas where Silver Peak had drilled. These locations crossed directly into sections marked by your uncle as unstable, Ellis said. This cannot be a mistake. These are deliberate choices, and the result is the pressure loss we are seeing today. He lifted the water samples John had brought from the hidden room and held them against the light. The cloudy ones swirled faintly in the jar, like bruises under the surface. "This is not natural evolution," he said. "This is mechanical disruption." Silver Peak's representatives entered the room now with stiff faces and confident steps. But the confidence dissolved quickly as the documents were handed to them. They examined the papers. They whispered among themselves. Their brows tightened. Their posture shifted. The commissioner called the head spokesperson forward. The man cleared his throat and attempted to speak calmly. He said the documents were misleading. He said the workers had misunderstood. He said the company operated with integrity. But this time, no one believed him. The rescued workers stood up. One of them spoke with a trembling voice. We told them it was unsafe. We told them the rock was weakening. They made us drill anyway. Buddy lifted his head and looked at the man as if acknowledging his courage. The room fell into a heavy silence. The commissioner then turned to the inspection team, who had studied the evidence in advance. Their lead inspector, a woman known for her strict fairness, stood. The findings are clear, she said. Silver Peak drilled outside permitted boundaries. They violated geological safety rules. Their actions contributed directly to the destabilization of the underground vein. The hall erupted in murmurs. Ellis bowed his head for a moment, as though honoring the years John's uncle had spent trying to protect the canyon alone. Martha wiped her eyes quietly. Silver Peak attempted one last defense, but the commissioner raised his hand. Enough. The evidence speaks for itself. He read the ruling. All illegal wells would be shut down immediately. Fines would be issued. The company would be required to support restoration efforts and rebuild damaged sections of the underground system. A long-term monitoring program would be created to ensure the safety of the canyon. Then he looked at John. This house of your uncle contains the only fully established observation point directly above the weak vein. We ask you to manage it officially. With your permission, it will serve as the primary monitoring station for Deep Canyon. Whispers rose across the room. Buddy nudged John gently, as if encouraging him. John took a breath. I will do it, he said, for the mountain and for my uncle. Buddy barked once, a low, bright bark that carried through the hall like a seal of approval. People smiled. Some even laughed softly with relief. The hearing ended, not with tension, but with gratitude. Residents came to thank John. Workers apologized for staying silent so long. Ellis clapped him on the shoulder. Martha embraced him gently. As John stepped outside, the cold air hit him with a sharp, clean feeling. Snow glimmered like crushed glass across the rooftops. The mountain stood silent, but not distant. It felt alive now, present, watching. Buddy walked at his side tail swaying with quiet pride. The truth was out. The danger was recognized. And justice had begun its steady work. John looked toward the ridge where the Cliffside house waited. We did it, Buddy. Buddy pressed against him warm and steady and full of unspoken trust. And for the first time, John felt the mountain breathe without strain, as though it could finally rest. Weeks passed slowly as winter loosened its grip on Deep Canyon. The storms faded into distant memory, and the air softened with the first hints that spring would one day return. The Cliffside house, once worn and trembling under the weight of old secrets, now stood renewed. Workers from the town helped reinforce the beams and secure the outer deck. Carpenters from the valley restored the windows and tightened the structure without changing its original character. The house still clung to the rock like a stubborn survivor, half anchored in stone and half reaching toward the open sky. But now it looked stronger, brighter, ready for a new chapter of its own. John moved in quietly. There was no ceremony, no speeches. Only the simple act of carrying his few belongings up the narrow path with Buddy trotting proudly at his side. For the first time in years, John walked into a home that was truly his. Not borrowed, not temporary, not the back seat of a truck that rattled each night with cold. He set his gear down inside the wooden room and stood still for a long moment. The wind hummed through the canyon. Buddy nudged his hand as if asking why he was not smiling yet. John let out a slow breath and felt the weight in his chest shift. "We made it, Buddy." Buddy wagged his tail, circling once around the center of the room before settling near the stove with a sigh of deep satisfaction. This place belonged to both of them now. Life changed quickly after that. The town recognized John not only as the man who uncovered the truth about Silver Peak, but as the official keeper of the monitoring station. Inspectors visited weekly to set up new sensors. Students from the local school came to learn about the canyon and its underground veins. Families hiked the path leading to the overlook above the house and waved down at John when they saw him working. Buddy became a quiet legend. Children called him the hero of Frosthaven. They carried small treats in their pockets, hoping he would notice them. Buddy accepted their affection calmly, standing tall with the dignity of a dog who understood his purpose. He returned their pats with a gentle nudge and followed the younger ones along the fence line to make them laugh. The workers John had rescued visited often too. They brought updates about their recovery and news of their new jobs after leaving Silver Peak. The freckled young man brought his family one afternoon. His little daughter hugged Buddy tightly and declared that he was the bravest dog in the whole world. Buddy accepted this praise with a quiet patience that made everyone smile. As spring crept closer, the sounds of the canyon changed. The underground hum of the weakened vein grew steadier. The restored pressure readings confirmed what Professor Ellis had hoped. The mountain was healing. The water was returning to its natural rhythm. John spent many mornings in the monitoring room below the floor. He kept careful notes using the exact handwriting style of his uncle as a small tribute. He felt a connection to the man who had lived half his life alone in this place, trying to protect the mountain when no one listened. Now that burden had become a shared purpose. At night, John sat on the wooden porch, overlooking the deep blue canyon. The repaired lantern on the railing cast a soft glow that blended with the dusk. The sky stretched over them in shades of silver and dark purple. Buddy lay beside him every evening, his head resting on John's boot. Sometimes John spoke aloud, even when no one else was present. "I never thought this place would feel like home." Buddy opened his eyes each time, as if answering him with steady silence. John looked across the landscape. The canyon walls rose like ancient guardians watching the world with patient, timeless eyes. The trees stood tall again. The wind carried the scent of pine and distant water. Far below, the river that had shaped the canyon for centuries flowed with quiet strength. He remembered the nights he had spent sleeping in the truck, the mornings waking to cold metal and no clear path ahead. He remembered the isolation of returning from war and drifting through towns that never felt like they belonged to him. Now he had purpose. He had steady ground beneath his feet. He had a home built half from wood and half from stone. And he had Buddy, who had guided him through storms, through fear, through darkness, always forward, always toward the truth. Professor Ellis visited often. One evening, he stood beside John on the porch and looked down at the canyon. "Your uncle would be proud," he said. "He watched over this place alone. You watch over it with the whole town behind you now." John nodded quietly. "I think he wanted someone to listen. I think Buddy heard him first." Buddy lifted his head as if to accept the compliment. Ellis chuckled and rested a hand on the dog's back. As the days lengthened, John added small touches to the house: a new shelf for maps, a repaired table for equipment, a simple coat rack by the door. Nothing extravagant, nothing unnecessary, just pieces of a life being rebuilt with patience. More than once, John woke in the night and walked to the porch just to breathe the quiet air. The canyon glowed under moonlight. Buddy followed him each time, even if half asleep. They stood together under the open sky until the cold settled into their clothes and sent them back inside. One afternoon, as sunlight broke through the last of the winter clouds, John stepped outside and felt a deep calm settle into him. A calm he had not felt in decades. Buddy walked to his side and leaned gently against him. "We are home, Buddy." Buddy wagged his tail once slow and content. The house stood firm on the cliff. The town stood stronger because of the truth. The mountain breathed easier. And John, once lost between battles and long roads, finally found a place where the world did not pull him away. Deep Canyon was no longer a wound. It had become a promise. And in that promise, two souls, who had wandered for far too long, discovered what they had been searching for: a home, a purpose, a peace that stayed. In the end, this story is not only about a man and his loyal dog, or a house clinging to the cliffs of Deep Canyon. It is about how broken lives can find purpose again when courage and kindness rise above fear. It is about a community learning that every voice matters and that healing begins when people choose to stand together. John and Buddy did not search for a miracle, yet a miracle found them in the form of trust, truth, and a second chance. If this story has touched your heart, remember that God often works through quiet moments and unexpected paths. He lifts the weary, guides the lost, and strengthens those who choose hope over despair. As you continue your own journey, I invite you to share this story with someone who may need encouragement. Leave a comment to tell us where you are watching from and what inspired you. Subscribe to the channel to join this growing community of faith and compassion. May God watch over you, bless your home, and fill your days with gentle miracles.